Okay, we're going to get started. So if you could take your seats if you're not seated. I want to say before we begin, just as a cautionary note, that C-SPAN is taping this tonight. So if you don't want to be on camera, you might want to move over to the sides. And just keep that in mind in the Q&A, although I'll try to remember to remind you when that happens. As you know, Guantanamo is central to the work of the Center on National Security. We are delighted to be able to have yet another panel on Guantanamo with some of the more thoughtful people about the issue, and many of whom have been thinking about Guantanamo since the day it opened in 2002. It's hard to imagine that when it did open, that if you had said, you know, in 2016, we're just going to have a panel on this place to talk about maybe thinking about ending it, that would have been a reality. When Guantanamo was opened, there was no idea of having it last more than 6 months or 18 months. The Pentagon would have been appalled by the idea, and a number of things happened along the way which made the emptying of Guantanamo, the closing of Guantanamo, nearly impossible. Today, what we want to find out is how impossible is it to close Guantanamo? Will it close by the end of the Obama presidency? And if it does close by then, what will it take? We're joined by a superb panel, which I'm delighted to have here, and I will introduce them very briefly. You have their bios. To my right as well as Dixon, who is from the Center for Constitutional Rights. The thing about the Center for Constitutional Rights is you really can't think about Guantanamo and the detainee issues without thinking about CCR. They were the first of the civil liberties organizations to understand that the indefinite detention issue was of crucial importance. They followed this through with many of the habeas cases, but it is central to the conversation when the historians, some of whom may be on this panel, write about Guantanamo. The CCR will be at the center of it, and much of Wells's work will be at the center of it. To his right is Dan Rosenthal. Now, we are very lucky to have Dan here, and his email to me when I wrote to him and said, will you come and be here, said, 4 hours ago, I left my job at the White House. Good timing. So among the things he did in his work with the National Security Council was to head up thinking about Guantanamo and how to get people out of Guantanamo. And we're eager to hear everything you're not allowed to say, that you weren't allowed to say before you left. So think about that. That's what we want to hear. Prior to that, he worked at the Department of Justice in the National Security Division and a number of federal jobs that were related to national security. So he brings a good perspective, an interagency perspective, and most importantly, a White House perspective. And we know that he has the answer. So we're going to hold him to it. To his right is Tom Wilner. Tom was one of the very first people I ever talked to about Guantanamo. I believe it was 2003. I called him up and I said, you know, I heard that you were working on Guantanamo and I really don't understand anything. Will you meet with me? And so he did. I went to his office and he just opened up a whole world for me of understanding what it meant to function in the Middle East, how he had come to know about Guantanamo, which is different than how a civil liberties lawyer comes to Guantanamo, but had to do with what it meant to represent individuals from the Middle East who then cared about what was happening at Guantanamo. And so his perspective, he's been there from beginning to end, is invaluable, and I am just completely thrilled to have him here. To my left is Janet Reitman. Janet's written a number of award-winning stories for Rolling Stone magazine. She's written 2 that are very important to the study of terrorism and terrorism prosecutions domestically. One of them was on Tsarnaev from the Boston bombings, Boston Marathon bombing. One of them was on ISIS, and I think we did a panel on the ISIS one before. Her recent piece, which came out this month, is on Guantanamo, and I just can't wait to hear her she's the newcomer to the conversation and has really done a wonderful job of covering her bases and trying to understand what's going on. And to her left is Carol Rosenberg. Carol is, it's hard to think that anybody would want to do a panel on Guantanamo without having Carol there. I would advise against it. I once had a phone call with Carol years ago when we could still remember the beginning of Guantanamo. That might disappear. And she said, you know, she said, you know, when went to Guantanamo for those first detainees coming off the plane, it suddenly dawned on me that this was the first time that I was in a place where there weren't going to be cameras, there was going to be nobody to tell the story. I was actually the camera. My words were going to be the camera. And it always stuck with me as a sense of, as a metaphor for the larger. Carol's eyes have been the only set of eyes, and that includes the military, and that includes the detainees, and that includes the entire apparatus, the only set of eyes that we've had at Guantanamo from the very beginning. And I don't know if it'll be to the end, but to this point, to our thinking about the end in some kind of realistic way. So I'm delighted to have this panel. We're going to start with Wells, who's going to talk a little bit about how we're going to close it. Right? You're going to tell us that.
I'm going to give you the answer right now.
Okay, thank you.
Right now. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join the panel. Is Guantanamo going to close by the end of the administration? I think that's the question that everyone wants to know the answer to. And my answer is, I hope so. And it depends. It depends very much on the president. I think President Obama has the power to close the prison. I think the moment is now. I think the moment has been every day since he got into office. But it depends on what he does in the next year. He's always had legal authority to close the prison. That's a view that we've had throughout his administration. And yet what we've seen is a lack of willingness to use all of that authority and to use it in a bold and even aggressive way to close the prison. I can give you many, many examples going back to 2009. One of the earliest examples was when the president balked at bringing the Uyghurs to the United States. But these missed opportunities continue up until now. And I think ultimately there are two things that have to happen, two things that the president has to do in order to close the prison. One is he needs to get his own house in order, as it were. He needs to get all of the agencies that, in his administration moving in the same direction to implement his mandate to close the prison. There is a dynamic that exists now. I think everyone is aware of it. If you follow this issue, the State Department is trying to transfer people. You have the Defense Department, which is obstructing and delaying this at times. And that needs to end, and that needs to come from the president. The second thing that needs to happen is there need to be some fundamental policy changes. As an outsider, it seems like the administration continues to adhere to policies that in some instances never really made any sense. For example, the resumption of the military commission system, or adhering to policies that maybe made sense in 2003 or 2006 or even 2009, but really don't make sense anymore. An example of that is the continuing effort by the Justice Department to fight detainee legal challenges to their detention. It just doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. But there's a dynamic that occurs now still. I'll give you one example in terms of litigation. A colleague of mine at the center represents a Yemeni man named Tariq Boda, who's 74 pounds. He's been on hunger strike for 8 years. And there's no disagreement about his health status, right? I mean, he could die in Guantanamo at any moment. He's been cleared for release for many, many years. And so we filed a legal challenge to his detention. So, look, he needs to be transferred under the Geneva Conventions. That sets in motion a machinery, right? And what happens is that sort of by default or by policy, the administration gears up to fight that case, right? The Justice Department goes into litigation mode. They go to fight that case. And there needs to be someone to step in and say, well, wait a second, why are we doing this? Maybe this doesn't make sense anymore. Why do we want to fight to keep a person in Guantanamo who we ourselves have said needs to be transferred, and by the way, is 74 pounds? From the outside, certainly what it looks like is happening is that you have this fight within the interagency system, and maybe it gets kicked up to the White House, but ultimately I think gets kicked back down to the agencies, right? And so Tariq Boda is still in Guantanamo. That's not the way to close Guantanamo. That is not an approach to Guantanamo policy that's going to succeed in getting everyone out of the prison. And cases like Tarek Bauder are the easy cases, right? I mean, the State Department has been making great strides in transferring the men who are cleared. There have been a number of transfers this month, including 2 today. They've been doing a great job. But those are the easy cases. There are other categories of men who present more difficult challenges in terms of closing the prison. Men in the indefinite detention category, which we at the center think should be a null set. We don't think there should be anybody in indefinite detention, but nonetheless there are at this moment, right? There's nothing really that's being done to get those men out of Guantanamo, right? There's a periodic review board process that tries to determine whether these men can be cleared for transfer. That process is moving very, very slowly, and it's not going to be complete by the end of this year. It's not going to be complete by the end of the Obama administration, so that has to change. And then you have prosecutions, right? There are 10 people who have charges against them right now or who have been already convicted. And you see sort of a very similar scenario, I think, as an outsider from a policy perspective. You still have this preference for military commissions rather than Article III federal court prosecutions. And that certainly, it seems to us to be a holdover from the failed effort to bring the 9/11 defendants here to New York several years ago, right? From that point on, there doesn't seem to have been any appetite to try to transfer men out of commissions or to bring to federal court or even to bring new charges in federal court. I'll say again, the president has the power, in our view, to do some of these things, right? In terms of federal court, there are possible avenues to bring people to federal court if that's something that needs to happen. And again, I'll give you just one specific example. There are detainees in Guantanamo who I suspect would plead guilty in federal court, right? People who are now uncharged, people like Abu Zubaydah, right? The famous Abu Zubaydah. I don't represent him, I don't speak for him, but I suspect that he may be willing to plead guilty. I don't know that anyone's ever asked him. And if Guantanamo is going to be closed, you have to deal with cases like that are more difficult cases than Tarek Bauder's case. They're more difficult than the men who were transferred today. I just don't see any progress in that regard. We don't see any movement in that direction. We see a continuing preference, as I said, for military commissions, 14 and a half years after 9/11, right? And in fact, we're losing ground on the military commissions. The charges that were brought against a number of these men, including one of my clients, are being struck down, and so you're losing ground, right? I don't shed a tear for those lost charges, believe me, but the point is the president's really not, in our view, taking the necessary steps to do something about this situation, right? We saw at the very end of December, the president's last press conference, where he said, we're going to continue to try to work with Congress to change the law, right? I mean, in our view, that's naive, if not outright delusional. Right? You have potentially the worst Congress. The president faces the worst Congress right now than he's ever faced in terms of Guantanamo policy. And that can't be the strategy for closing Guantanamo. So there needs to be more aggressive action.
Before you just say any more, because what power does he have? If Congress has passed a law which says you cannot transfer detainees to the United States, right? What's the power that you think he has to be able to do this in defiance of Congress? What can he do? Well,
I think there are all sorts of avenues that he could pursue and explore. I mean, there are questions of statutory interpretation, right? If someone pleads guilty, are they subject to these laws, right? There are scenarios that have been discussed in which the president could potentially make decisions about himself, or go to court potentially to get rulings on the constitutionality of some of these issues. Okay. All of these, there are many avenues that could be explored from a legal perspective. I don't think any of those have been tried. And that's the point, right? If you're going to miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and if the president doesn't try to take some bold action, then he's not going to succeed in closing Guantanamo.
Okay, got it. Well, that puts the spotlight on you, Dan. That's a perfect
Sure
lead-in to.
My apologies in advance.
That was not a positive review. And, I mean, if constantly, you can't write about the idea of closing Guantanamo without saying, President Obama promised on his second day in office that he was going to close Guantanamo within a year. And we don't have to get into the reasons that he wasn't able to do that or decided not to prioritize that. But the real question is Wells right? Is it just too much of has he dropped the ball? I know you're not going to say this, but has the White House dropped the ball? Have they picked up the ball and they're running with it and we just don't appreciate it? What's your enlightened?
So there's a lot there. So first of all, thanks very much for having me on this panel, and thanks to all of you for coming. Closure of Guantanamo is a very important issue, and it's great that people are focusing on it. I just want to say at the outset that I no longer work for the administration, so the views that I'm going to express today are my own. They don't reflect the White House views, although are informed by my time there. I do have a slightly more rosy picture, I think, than Wells does from my time at the White House. What I saw is people at the White House, people at the Department of Defense, people at the State Department, and at the other national security agencies that work on this, Department of Homeland Security, the Justice Department, and the intelligence community, working very hard to try to close Gitmo. In the last year, during my time there, we successfully transferred nearly 40 detainees, which is a huge uptick in the amount of transfers that have taken place. There was a lull for a period of time, and that's now kicked up. 10 were transferred last week. Two, as Wells noted, were transferred today. So there's definitely an uptick in the amount of transfers. That's for the category of people who are already cleared for release and have been cleared for release for a number of years.
And some of them come off the indefinite detention list that he was
right.
referring to.
Separately, there's the indefinite detention list. I'm just backing up a little bit for a little bit of context, if that's okay. There's the we call it currently ineligible for transfer. I don't know that I would call it the indefinite detention list, because the idea is that they not be detained indefinitely. And there are periodic review boards that review their case, and that has an incredibly high success rate. When folks go through, and I don't know the exact percentage, but it's something like 80% of people.
17 to 20.
Yeah.
17 to 20.
85%.
Yeah, so that's a great rate. So we're taking people who are currently ineligible for transfer. The PRB process is determining that they can be safely transferred. They're then being moved over essentially into this other bucket of people who are eligible for transfer, and then they're being teed up for transfer. So that's going to whittle down the number of people who present the hardest case that Wells talking about, where what do you do with these guys who remain too dangerous in the government's view to transfer, but you obviously want to continue to close the base. Let me also just say that in terms of the slowness or the delay, Wells said that there's obstruction at DOD. I don't know. I'm not inside the head of everyone who works at DOD. People with whom I've worked are working hard to implement the president's policy, and in some ways I see this as a difficult problem working. There are checks and balances. The State Department has its own perspective. The State Department negotiates diplomatic agreements with foreign governments, and then because of that perspective, they're incentivized to work very quickly and aggressively to try to finalize transfers. The Department of Defense doesn't have that same diplomatic pressure. What they have is a statutory pressure. There's a statute in place that places a requirement directly on the Secretary of Defense that says that he may not transfer, he may not use funds. It's a funding provision. He may not use funds appropriated by Congress to transfer a detainee until he concludes that they can be safely transferred. So, rightly, in my view, they take their time, and they're very careful to make sure that every detainee who's presented to them for transfer meets the statutory requirement. So that's sort of the high-level sense of where things are. Wells started to talk about the overall plan for closing Gitmo. I think it's similar to the things we've just been talking about. Transfer people who you can transfer, whittle down the list of people who present a difficult case, and as the administration has said, the government's now looking at facilities in the United States. The idea being to transfer those remaining detainees who can't be safely transferred, in the government's view, to transfer them to the United States while we continue to explore for them whether there are any other options that are available. Maybe it's an Article 3 prosecution, for example, or maybe there's another country that they can go to under some more restrictive conditions.
Speaking of Article 3 prosecutions, Wells made reference to the military commissions going backwards instead of forwards, something that I think it has a lot of validity in terms of the erosion of charges that can be brought and the inability to even, to get through the pretrial hearings, let alone to actually mount a trial. So we're looking at years, it seems like, even for the 9/11 defendants, which seem to me the most important defendants in the country to try in the case of 9/11. Do you think that that's a widely held view in Washington, that the military commissions are going backwards, or was Wells right when he said that there seems to still be a belief in the military commissions? And just to say, we had General Martins here last year to talk about the military commissions, and and when you read his what he says in his public statements, what you see is very much a feeling that they're going to work someday, somehow. I'm just curious what you think the general sense, and not just in Washington, in the administration, is about the viability going forward of the military commissions.
So to some extent, I want to defer to what General Martins is saying about the viability of the military commissions, because he's in charge of executing that portion of this process. I think the military commissions are tough. It's an untested legal regime, and so the court is constantly faced with novel legal questions that in Article 3 context wouldn't necessarily be novel, have been tested. So that for sure slows things down. My own musing, I don't know a lot about the military commissions, but I just wonder if some of the delays are created by the detainees themselves and their lawyers, who are filing all sorts of challenges that are gumming up the system. I don't know, I'd love Wells's view, but if the true idea was, I'd like to get through my military commission, I wonder if that could happen more expeditiously without successive challenges on.
I think everyone's going to want to address that, so we're going to kind of come back to that. So before Wells answers that, let's go to Tom, who can give the first answer to that, but I think that's going to be much of what we talk about afterwards is, we haven't heard the term Gitmo bar in a while, but it raises the term, is the Gitmo bar somewhat responsible? So Tom, you've been involved in both the theoretical, legal part of this with Razul, with Boumediene, with El Oda, throughout the entire legal regime of this. But you've also have a sense of what's going on, particularly in your work now, which you might want to talk about with the detainees themselves. Do you think it's going to close?
Well, I'm going to be like a politician. I'm going to answer the question I want to answer.
I know.
Oh, no, Karen. Karen,
that's why
thanks
we
a lot.
love you, Tom.
Well, first, let me answer something Dan said. You got to remember, and let me give some facts. We've got 91, is it right? We have 91 people left at Guantanamo, which is down significantly. Of those, only 10 are in the military commission system. Only 10 of these people are in that. So we're talking about a minority. 3 of those have been convicted and are waiting there, are pled. The other 7 are waiting trial. There's no doubt in my mind that the lawyers are trying to gum up the works for them, and that's one of the reasons the military commissions, all the lawyers wanted military commissions rather than civilian trials because they knew they could gum it up forever. So, and that's probably what you do as a civilian lawyer. But let me talk about the other things which are more important. And let me say, first of all, Dan, congratulations on the work you did. I think that one of the great problems for the Obama administration is the White House did not take charge of this problem until recently. You've been there for a year, and in a year you did a lot of good things. You got a lot of people out. I think the White House before that sort of put it off the State Department or somewhere else. They didn't take charge centrally, as a lot of people are saying they were doing. I'm worried now that you've left because you were clearly pushing this through. Let me talk more about the great problem of Guantanamo to me has been not those people we charge with crimes, but the people we hold without charge or trial. You can do that during hostilities to hold people out of military conflict from returning to the conflict. But a lot of these people have just been there for years. And as I said, Of the people there, of the 91, 10 are in military commissions. 34 of them have been cleared, most of them for years, but they haven't been let out. One of the reasons is a lot of them are Yemenis and it's hard to find them a home, but now they're finding them homes, and that's great. I'm more concerned about this other category that we call indefinite detention, or when the Obama administration did its review, they put them the term called too dangerous to release but not capable of prosecution. And it's a false fact. It's a false fact which has really dominated discussions and political discussions. That categorization of them, characterization, gives the impression that these guys are, that the government knows that they're terribly dangerous killers, but some legal technicality is preventing them from being released. And it isn't true. I mean, it was a terrible characterization of them. For the most part, these people are held almost universally because there are allegations against them by other detainees while they were in detention. And there are all sorts of reasons people do that. In a lot of the cases, these are, people who got rewards for doing it, who are made allegations under pressure. But at most, if you read the allegations, and Jennifer Fenton is here, who pointed this out to me years ago, they are on WikiLeaks. If you compare them against each other, you'll see that a lot of these allegations are absolutely, the legal term which we use would be bullshit. They really are. And the proof of the pudding on that, and yet Congress debates these things, assumes that these people are dangerous killers who you can't release. If we look at the facts, they're not so. And as Dan was pointing out, they have what they call a PRB process to review them. And that PRB process, when it reviews them, is in the overwhelming majority of the cases finding that these guys are not dangerous, that they can be released. There is a tremendous problem that, as Wells said, that the administration has not put the resources in to do the PRB process promptly enough. There are, so, how many are scheduled now? 8? 8 are in schedule. They won't finish before the end of this year. They won't finish under the current schedule for 4 or 5 years or 10 years, and that's not enough. We should put more resources in and clear those. In a larger picture, and until we do, we're going to be holding a lot of innocent men. I mean, a lot of the intelligence reports about them, as Carol, I hope, will report, are just crazy. They're not credible, and yet they're given a presumption of reliability and validity both by the courts and the government. They've got to be looked at. Let me just talk in an overall picture, and then I'll shut up. Guantanamo is terribly important to this country, and I'm worried about the people there, and I want them treated well, and I want them home. But more than that, I'm worried about what it means for the country. Guantanamo was established to avoid the law. The whole purpose of Guantanamo, the Bush administration considered the law an impediment that it had to avoid. And it said if we put foreigners in a place that's technically outside our sovereign territory, we can avoid review by the courts and we can deprive them of legal rights. And unfortunately, although we won the Rasool case saying they have the right to habeas corpus, and we won the Boumediene case saying they have the constitutional right, the DC Circuit has said that they still don't have the rights of due process. If the government can put them over there, they're beyond the reach of the Constitution in other ways. And that's a horrible thing for this country. It's a horrible loophole from our goal. I find it reprehensible. I not only want the people home, I want the law corrected so the United States can stand by its principles and be proud of them and not try to avoid them.
Can I ask you guys one question, which is that there used to, the categories you were talking about, the indefinite detention, et cetera, there used to be more categories. There used to be a category of not the people that have been charged, but the people they thought were going to be tried by military commissions. Where did that category go?
In your list, they're called they're mixed in with the indefinite
because
detainees.
Is that what happened? They got moved into the indefinite?
You mixed them in with the indefinite.
Because that's what the Times did, so we just...
I just think it's how you slice it up and how you want to look at it. If you want to look at the proximity of the detainee to release, which, I mean, we're talking about closing Guantanamo, so it seems like that's what we're trying to figure out. Proximity to release seems to me that the best 3 buckets to talk about are ones who are in queue to be released. detainees who are not yet in queue to be released, but might someday, get there. So, or maybe there's 2 buckets. So, but you could think of them in other ways. When the EOTF, a group of interagency government folks got together in 2009, in 2010, and sort of figured out for each detainee, looked at them and said, what bucket are we putting? They also considered other things, people who we might be able to prosecute, for example.
So there are still people at Guantanamo in maybe that indefinite detention category now, or not yet released category, that who might be tried? Who might be tried in some kind of court?
As I understand,
because you
no.
said even Zubaydah, right?
As I understand, no.
No, okay. So it's
not exactly true.
I think there are probably I don't know if this for sure, but I think there are probably detainees who remain at Guantanamo who, back in 2009, had been identified for potential prosecution.
Right.
And they're still there. Now, I don't know whether they're in the now eligible for release category. Some may be there, depending on, maybe they've shifted over because of the PRB, or they may still be in the indefinite detention category. Part of the government's plan, as the government has said publicly, is to transfer out everyone you can, and then for the remainder to look at the individual detainee and try to identify individualized options for them.
Got it.
Which may include prosecution if that's feasible.
Interesting. Okay. Good. So Janet is, I'm going to turn to the female. I don't know how that happened. So Janet's, I don't get upset when I say this, but a newcomer to the conversation. This is a very long-standing conversation where everybody in it, even if we don't know each other personally, we know of each other. We've followed each other's work for a long time. There's sort of a general sharing of what Tom said, which is it's just so insulting to the rule of law, to many people, to have Guantanamo and to have what it symbolizes, which is indefinite detention. So Janet comes on the scene and somehow decided it would be a good idea to write about Guantanamo, which I'm not really sure how that happened. She'd been writing about terrorism prosecutions in the United States. And so she called a number of people to talk about it, and one of the people she called was me. And what was so interesting was her piecing this together by herself and being surprised by things that the rest of us were just sort of been talking about for years. And so my question to you, if you could kind of go back there, is what you went to Guantanamo, you figured out the situation,
Yes.
or what was there. What were the things that really surprised you, and that even though we have a vibrant press about it, we're really just,
Well, first
amazing
of
to you?
all, I see John Neffel, who is one of our colleagues at Rolling Stone occasionally, freelances for us and others. And he's the person who urged me to go to Guantanamo like 3 or 4 years ago. So I have to say thank you, because I actually was trying to get my editors to say yes to this idea for years. When they finally did say yes, the idea was, how is this place still open? And this terrible sort of remnant of 9/11 in a way. And what surprised me about it was how 9/11 still exists. It's a place where the September 11th mindset pretty much never dies. And I'm trying to think. The first thing is that it's kind of a fake war zone. You arrive there, it's dusty, there are tents, you sleep in tents. You sort of drive down, you arrive on a ferry, you drive down this dusty hill into this place that looks like a forward operating base for anyone who's ever covered a war, which I have. And I was appalled by this. I covered the Iraq War, I've been in other conflicts prior to that. And Guantanamo is suburbia, like any naval base, any military base out there, right? These are bases, no matter whether they're here in the United States or if they're, really anywhere, that are kind of built as little Americas, and that's normal. That's how a military installation works. They all have fast food restaurants. They all have, movie theaters. So that, which is always portrayed actually in stories about Gitmo as so bizarre, is actually not that bizarre. But what is bizarre is that there are these 2 pockets of the base that are very separate from one another. One, which is called Camp Justice, which is where the military commissions happen, and the other, which Carol has designated as the detention center zone, right? That was her line. By the way, everybody on this panel, except for Dan, were in my article. These are all my sources, so. And a few of you in the audience too, so thanks for all of you. But so you have these like two pockets, and those places are the war. And I was covering Iraq in 2004 and 2005, and it was like the war. I mean, you drive in there, and there's high security, and you can't take pictures, and like I said, you live in these tents, and it's dusty, and everybody's in their camo, and the entire mindset is, and I should go back and say, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military and the United States officials that are, part of the operation there, they live in these secure kind of bunker-like settings, right? So this is very secure, high security. You don't venture out into the red zone of the real country that you're in. And in Gitmo, you're in high security settings too. You have badges that you can't, you must wear when you're inside this, whether you're in Camp Justice or you're in the detention center area. You have special badges. You're not supposed to wear them when you go to lunch at the cafeteria, or you go to the gym where you can work out on a, like a very nice, treadmill, and then like take a sauna. I mean, literally, you can go and, take a shower in this beautiful facility. That would be like anybody's gym anywhere. But nicer. But you as a reporter or a human rights monitor or in many cases, a lawyer, must stay in a tent where you have showers in a tent, and you have like the bathrooms are also in a tent. I mean, so it's like this bizarre disconnect of modern American life set up for this infrastructure of several thousand, 4,000 or so naval officers, naval personnel, and contractors, and then 2,000 or so military guys who are just attached to these two the Gitmo that we think of, who live in this different world, and the reporters who go and cover this must live in that world. So that's the one thing that's particularly surprising. The second thing that's surprising is that, so the people who the people who are posted at Gitmo in terms of the detention and the legal operation there, there are National Guard troops. I don't want to offend them because, these are well-meaning people, but they're very naive and they're very ignorant. And this is actually, I think, a purposeful thing. There is no institutional memory at Guantanamo at all. And the reason for that is because the people who have been posted there are on these 9-month deployments. Most of them are not professional soldiers, so they don't even have, some of them have deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. A number of them, I think, have, but in very limited capacities. Many of them have not. This is the only time they will ever serve in the military in any kind of active context from their real-life jobs, which range from being like a prison guard to being a taxi driver to being completely unemployed to being, as this one like lovely public affairs officer that we both worked with, he's an 8th grade high school or junior high school teacher, English teacher. And so this is, to them, this is their one shot at, kind of serving their country. And they know absolutely nothing about the history of Guantanamo at all. They don't, most of them are very young, 22, 23. There was one kid that I was spending some time with, and he was taking me on a tour of the detention area, including Camp X-Ray, which is the infamous, place where the detainees, quote unquote, the prisoners were originally taken in 2002, and they weren't there for very long, but that's where they had the dog cages, and that's, all these sort of famous pictures from there. And it's now really overgrown. And he was taking me on a tour. There's like, these are outside cages, and there's like vines, and, it's like the jungle. And he's taking me towards these like little interrogation sheds that are made out of wood. And I remember, I having covered other things, said, this is kind of like Abu Ghraib, because it is. There was sort of the setup of it, and the history of Guantanamo is that the general who had set the whole place up then went and took this setup and mindset and everything to Abu Ghraib, and this was also exported to other countries and other U.S. operations. So, I made a joke to him. I'm like, there's this kind of Abu Ghraib-y, ha ha ha. And he looked at me like he had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, do you know anything about this? I said, he was like, well, when we trained, in our security training, they told us to never take pictures, right? If anybody remembers, he didn't really know what it was. Yeah, he didn't. He knew Abu Ghraib kind of. He knew he was not supposed to take pictures of any of the prisoners because that could get him in trouble. Don't torture them and don't take pictures. But he didn't know that the whole history, the reason that Abu Ghraib was such an aberration, the reason this happened, those practices started at Guantanamo. Very well documented, right? Torture. The torture report came out, and you have all kinds of reports of abuses. Many years and years, 14 years of writing on this, which everybody else on this panel is an expert on. And, but that ignorance, he had no idea about that. He didn't know any of that history, and after a day or two, some of these kids that we were spending our time with, basically were trying to learn from us, and we were teaching them about their own American history, which is something that, and one kid said, well, I'm really happy that I'm on this, tour with you. I'm taking you around because I get to learn the things that you're learning. And I said, well, actually, I'm not learning anything. I was like, you need to read the story I write, then maybe you'll learn something. So, but the point of it is that this is an intentional thing. There's, in my view, you have troops on very short deployments who don't have any idea of who they're guarding. They don't want to know. They're told not to know. They don't. They're terrified of the people that they're guarding. They think they're dangerous criminals. They think they're criminals. And the point of Guantanamo, and the thing that's so un-American about it, as Tom Wilner will talk about, a lot, is that they've never been charged with anything for the most part. 10 of them are actually in the military commissions process. The rest of them have not been charged with a crime, and they certainly haven't been convicted of a crime. So what's horrific as a reporter is that this is a prison. You are reporting on a prison that the military is very proud of, and they will tell you endlessly how awesome their facilities are and how this was modeled after such and such high security facility in some, in the Midwest somewhere in Indiana. And the point is that these people have never been charged with a crime. They're just detained. They're interred there. And they've been interred there for 14 years. And so the fact that everyone who is charged with watching them, handling them, promoting their work there, doesn't have a clue about this, is not really connected to it, does not ask a question about it, and seemingly doesn't really think very deeply about it, is super highly, highly disturbing. And then I think the last thing I would say is that all of that setup, and I've written a very, very long article, so I'm trying to sum up this article in a short amount of time, which I can't do, but and it was a much longer article originally. But every aspect of one's visit to Gitmo is designed, as Carol will talk about as well, for somebody like me, who is newcomer, who doesn't have a history there. I have no history either. I just know the facts because I've covered this stuff for a long time, and I'm an adult, so I remember 9/11. I know it's happened since 9/11. But I'm not 22 any longer, sadly. The place is set up for people who know nothing. So the government, or the military, can kind of promote the same sort of narrative, whatever the narrative is that they want to promote, which is that this is a transparent, safe, humane operation, that they're treating everybody well, that this is not what you used to, it's not some horrible place, it's not Abu Ghraib, it's not the Gitmo that you remember from the mid-2000s. Nobody's being tortured. You'll hear that over and over again. It's all clean, safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're just doing a really professional, good job here, and we want to show you what a good job we're doing. And so everything about it is set up for this message. And when you do a tour of the detention facility in particular, you're rushed through it in a way that that leaves you barely any time to even ask serious questions, penetrating questions. If you do ask any serious questions, as we may talk about later, you get in trouble, which happened to me. But the most crucial aspect of this is that, this is about however many prisoners there are. So there are now 93. 91. Okay, when I was there was 107. And I don't care if there's 20. As I still think, personally, and journalistically, that it's worth reporting on people who've never been charged with a crime, who are interred by the United States government for 14 years. I mean, I think that's an important story. No matter if there's 3 people, it's un-American to continue to do that without having some sense of resolution. So their entire purpose is to not show you those prisoners. And the most disturbing aspect of Gitmo is that, tremendous suffering happened at this place. It's a very disturbing, you get this vibe being there that makes you really uncomfortable, and you don't quite know why. There's this kind of banality about it, the way everybody's kind of like naively unable to answer your questions, the way it's sort of like just set up in this very banal, clean, antiseptic kind of environment. And yet there are people there who have been there for a long, long time, who have no idea when and if they'll ever go home, who have no idea when and if they'll ever be put on trial. Most of them will not be. And that's its own sort of purgatory. And that's its own sort of torture, I actually think. I think the torture of being cleared, quote unquote, for release from Gitmo in 2005 or something, or 2008 or 9, and then not being released for the next however many years, 6 or 8 or 10 years, that's torturous. So, and those are very important points. And so when you bring these points up, there is no one in the military who will answer those questions for you, who will engage with you on those points, and you cannot see anyone who is detained at Guantanamo except for maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And it's part of the tour, and you see them in this communal area. These are only detainees, by the way, who are compliant. So they're the ones who have not caused any trouble. They're not the high value people. They're not KSM. Not anyone who has been charged who has been charged with a crime or who is considered a high value prisoner. And the experience of it is you sort of look at them through this glass, and it's one-way glass, and it's like you're looking at animals in a zoo, and you can't interview them. People would ask me, like, even our own fact checkers were like, did you get to interview them? And it's kind of, I laugh because it's such a ridiculous question, because no, journalists cannot interview anyone interred at Guantanamo, even though lawyers like Wells has said to me many times he would love me to interview his clients. The clients themselves would be thrilled to talk to reporters, but a lot of them, but you can't. So it's this, the entire kind of experience of the place is forgetting. Forget that we found a place that is an extra legal, no man's land. It's the illegal equivalent of outer space was how somebody in the Bush administration phrased it. So forget that. Forget that this place isn't necessarily legal. Forget that these people may not have committed a crime. Forget that most of them were rounded up by not on the battlefield, were handed over in many cases by fellow tribesmen, by people who had a beef with their families, by lots of other forces, or by foreign governments. Forget that, and forget that they've not been charged with anything, and that they've existed in this kind of endless limbo, and just focus instead on, the idea that President Obama wants to close Guantanamo, and we are going to carry out his policy whenever that happens. And until then, we're going to treat the detainees as fairly and as humanely as possible. And that's outrageous.
So so what we have standing between us and forgetting is Carol Rosenberg, who just keeps us every day, refuses to let us forget, which I don't know if that's a curse or a blessing to have that job, because somebody has to be there to do it. Well, one of the things I'm really glad you brought up, and one of the things that Wells and Tom have dealt with, and many of the attorneys, is the detainees themselves. I'm always astonished by these policy conversations that will mention the detainees, but not really talk about who these people are that have been in indefinite detention for so long. And then every now and then, Omar Khadr or somebody else will have a film make about them. They will be interviewed. The footage on Omar Khadr being questioned and then returning to Canada, and what he said is overwhelming emotionally. I'm always disturbed by the fact that there's no human element. What Carol, I'd like you to, I know you have tons to say, and I want you to say whatever you want, just like Tom, you're going to say whatever. But I just want to talk about how I would like you to talk a little bit about how you kept having, there was always something new. It changed so much. You know, that guidebook that shows you, what to tell visitors when they come here, how many additions, so how many times Guantanamo has changed while you've been there, and what it's meant for you. So, but in addition to what you're going to answer. So go ahead.
Maybe I can do this. First of all, I just wanted to, I wanted to say to what Janet said, no self-respecting reporter really wants to be a prop in a Pentagon talking point about transparency. And that really is the contract you make when you go to Gitmo, because they let you there so they can say it's transparent. And I'm just going to say right from the start, Janet was the last person allowed in the detention center. They have shut it, and this is a tremendous problem. Not Janet's a problem, it's a tremendous problem that they no longer allow reporters inside the detention center to look at the detainees. It's not a comfortable thing to feel like you're at the zoo looking through one-way glass, but in the absence of being able to actually have reporters going in, talking to guards, seeing conditions, engaging with people in the detention center, we really don't know what's gone on there. And I think that some strange things have gone on there. And I think if you look at the coverage of what we've heard from some of the lawyers since they imposed this blackout, there's some very big questions about why lawyers have to buy detainees footwear in a detention center that at this moment, if you do the most dramatic crunch of what it costs, it works out to $4.4 million a detainee. I don't necessarily agree with that crunch, but I understand how they got there. A detainee a year, yeah. And we can talk about how they do that detainee math, which I did my own study and would not necessarily agree with everything that they threw in the pot, but the budget that causes Guantanamo, the detention center, to exist and supports nearly 2,000 staff of soldiers and contractors and civilians. If you take all of the costs associated with that and the commissions, and you divide it by, as of yesterday, 91 detainees, you reach at this moment, somebody should double check my math, I think it's 4.4 million. But that is the contract you make when you go to Guantanamo, and it's not comfortable, and I think people have to constantly push to get meaningful answers to hard questions and get to see meaningful things when they go down there. And sometimes I like to talk about the story of Karen going down there, because there was a point, I love that story. There was a point when they just stopped showing her anything she was interested in seeing. And I tell that story. I had not met Karen before. I was shocked. I was shocked. She basically was being led around on a tour that had ceased to give her the subject matter information she needed. And she said, take me to my room and pick me up when it's time for me to go to the plane. Because
That's pissed off.
Yeah.
We call that chutzpah.
I love that.
But I can't do that. I have to go and try every time I go and push as hard as I can to get answers to questions. So that was one point I wanted to make. People. What I like about Karen's questions is it appeals to sort of the geek in me. So the question is, what happened to the people? Who are the people that should be tried, and what happened to them? So in 2009 and 2010. This task force, using intelligence that we now know to be terribly flawed, categorized people into different buckets, and one of the buckets were people who were referred for prosecution. Tariq Osawa, who left yesterday as a clear detainee, having gone through the parole board and is now starting his new life in Bosnia, was on that list to be prosecuted. It became clear as they worked their way from that task force until his parole board hearing around a year ago, that there was nothing that they could sustain to prosecute him for. And we could have an entire panel on war crimes that aren't war crimes, or war crimes that were once thought to be war crimes and are no longer acceptable war crimes. To which I wanted to just say to Dan, you know, I've been hearing since the very first commissions that the defense attorneys are the reason why there's delay, and that the defense attorneys file motions that seem to derail the process. And what I know is that the defense attorneys' motions that seem to derail the process went to the Supreme Court and concluded that the process at that moment, at the beginning, was illegitimate. That defense attorneys who have filed motions that challenge the integrity of military commissions have been reshaping military commissions throughout this. Crimes that were once considered crimes are no longer considered crimes. The reason that those 36 people who were chosen as candidates for prosecution cannot be prosecuted is those crimes that they considered possibly legitimate in 2009, or the courts where they thought they might take them, including federal court in 2009, are no longer available. And so what you have are this parole board working their way through people who were once thought to be possibly candidates for war crimes trials, no longer eligible because it doesn't fit into the paradigm of what military commissions are, in what they like to call the indefinite detention bucket. But I think they're very distinct from people who were forever prisoners, because these were people who were told in some fashion or another, we think you committed a crime and we're going to let you have your day in court and you can defend yourself. It's not the forever prisoners who were told, we don't think you committed a crime, but we just don't feel good about letting you go. We're afraid of you and we're going to keep you here. They're two very distinct categories. And what we know if you study the discovery inside commissions is there's probably 6 people left among those original 36 who potentially might be tried. And the rest of them have been systematically either moved out of that bucket. A couple of them, one of them went back to, maybe 2 of them went back to Kuwait. I mean, a lot of them have been released in different fashions who were once considered candidates for trial. And no, lots of them haven't gone before the parole board, the PRB. And the idea that it's not going to be finished by the time that Obama leaves office is true, but frankly, the parole board that Obama set up said that everybody gets one in the first year and then they get every 6 months review. They have not in any way accomplished the meaning of the parole board. Okay, and then the subject of, is Guantanamo going to close? When President Obama ran for, when he campaigned and said he wanted to close Guantanamo, I think it was fairly clear that what he was saying was, we're going to try people or let them go. He believed, reading between the lines, that you should not, that what Bush had set up was somehow illegitimate, that people were entitled to trials or people were entitled to release. What happened in the first year of that process is they realized that there was another category of prisoner that did not meet either of those definitions, and those are the forever prisoners. They're people who they don't want to try, they can't try, they know they can't try, but they are afraid to let go. And once you have that category, and we call them the forever prisoners because they are prisoners of a war that does not have a mechanism to end. If you do not have someone to surrender on the other side and to end this war on terror, how do you send home prisoners of that war that you think are legitimate prisoners of that war? When does that war end? So when this administration says that they want to close Guantanamo, what they're really telling you is that they want to move Guantanamo. They are not saying there will be no Guantanamo. They're saying we're going to do Guantanamo-style detention in the United States. We call it Guantanamo North. At the Miami Herald, we come up with these little expressions to try to forever prisoners, the detention center zone. We come up with these little expressions to try to explain complicated processes. Guantanamo North means you can shut down that detention center zone, you can send home all the National Guard, you can end the prison arrangement that's there, but there will be people that they want to bring to the United States and have Guantanamo-style detention. They want to continue to have commissions. I mean, people are talking about the plan. We know what the plan is. We haven't seen all the bits of the plan, but that's what it is. They want to continue to have commissions. They want to continue to have forever prisoners, law of war prisoners, prisoners of war who are not entitled to POW, call it what you want, and that number is shrinking, but they want to continue a Guantanamo-style detention in the United States. The only way that this can happen in Barack Obama's administration is if he persuades Congress to let him do it, or he decides that he has the authority to defy Congress and will pick them up and move them. There's really, those are the two choices. And, you know, we've heard on the panel, some people believe he has that authority. We haven't heard from the president whether he believes he has that specific authority. He does believe that Congress's prohibitions on him moving people to the United States is at odds with his commander-in-chief authority, and he believes the executive has the prerogative to do that. We've seen that in his writing, in his signing statements. But that's how Guantanamo, the detention center in Cuba, closes. It is by moving it. And the only way it gets moved is there is some grand political deal that comes out of this plan that we're all waiting for, that suddenly all of those members of Congress and the Senate who love to demagogue the issue of Guantanamo change their mind and say, fine, let him come here. Or he comes up with a way to move them without permission of Congress and possibly without the knowledge of Congress, because as we were talking about earlier, when he goes to move them, invoking his commander-in-chief authority, it likely ends up in the courts, where we have I guess maybe a request for a restraining order. The lawyers can explain it better than I can. And then the courts get to decide whether or not the commander-in-chief authority trumps the congressional authority. And I don't know if there's enough time for that thing to work its way through the courts. How's that?
I think that it's like, it depends on how you define close.
Correct.
Right? Okay, so one thing that Carol touched upon that I want to turn to you attorneys about, which is if the detainees did come here, right? If Obama found a way, let's forget the logistics of how. There are a number of people who would say that, who would make that bargain. A number of defense attorneys and civil libertarians who would make that bargain because they think that there's a way into the legal system at that point. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, I think with respect to whether detainees would be better off here in the United States versus remaining at Guantanamo, all I can say about that as someone who represents men who are detained is that it depends. It's really a detainee by detainee issue. There are certainly some who are of the view that being brought into the United States would give them a better shot at getting out through habeas, because they would have, at that point, full constitutional rights, including due process rights in particular. There are others who are not sure that would have result in any practical benefit for them. And for some, there's a more practical concern, which is conditions of confinement, right? And there's a lot of talk when we hear about the plan and bringing detainees to the United States for continued detention without charge or trial. There's often, with that, a lot of talk about putting these men in supermax prison, right? And again, these are people who are are not convicted of crimes. And we're talking about, we hear members of the administration, members of Congress talking about putting them in supermax prison. Carol also mentioned the grand bargain. I mean, one of the concerns about a grand bargain, one of the things that came up in legislation that ultimately was not enacted a couple of years ago, was a plan, I believe it was put forth by Senator Graham, which included, as part of authority to bring detainees here, a limitation on their rights, and particularly an attempt to roll back some of their habeas corpus rights. Really, I think ultimately to prevent challenges to conditions of confinement, right? So there's this idea that in order to sell detainee transfers to the United States, the administration is going to have to agree to put them into solitary confinement in ADX Florence or something equivalent to that, which in our view would be completely unlawful. And we would challenge that on behalf of our clients, but there would be an added piece to that, which would be, as part of the legislation, to be an attempt to strip those rights. And I'm confident we would prevail on that, but you're talking about a 2 or 3 year legal process in which your client is potentially sitting in solitary confinement in Florence. Totally unacceptable as far as that's concerned. But again, there's some detainees who are absolutely willing to take that shot, and I know Tom has views on this, but
let's turn to Tom, because Tom described Guantanamo as created to be outside the law. And which very few would dispute. And I might say that outer space does have laws, so it was worse than outer space. And do you think that bringing them to the United States would, in essence, enable lawyers to find a way to bring this whole thing inside the law?
Well, I do, but let me, and I will answer that directly, but let me go back a moment to what Carol said, because I think. And then I'll come to this. Carol, I don't think there's an assumption people make that this category of forever detainees are people who we know should be held or fought in some war, but you can't prosecute them. It's not that. The evidence on these people, the reason they can't be prosecuted is because there is no evidence that would stand up in a court of law. At most, there are allegations against people which raise suspicions that they may have been associated with Al-Qaeda or Taliban, and mostly at a very low level. But it's suspicions. It's precisely the sort of non-evidence that people in the everybody could be have a suspicion on them, but under our system, you can't hold people based on suspicion. Okay, so it's not that they know that they are, and this is really, I use the BS category, but the allegations are so flimsy, they just wouldn't stand up. They can't, so let me.
And the support for that argument that you
Yes.
make is in the numbers, that there were 48 of them when the task force created them, and they've systematically peeled that label off of, there's currently 25 of them, but 2 of them died. So
That's right.
do the math. Others went through processes that concluded that that label, that category was no longer or was inappropriate. Just like enemy combatants who one day became no longer enemy combatants, they reevaluate them. I'm not
I'm just
defending.
No, you're
I'm
not. I know. I just
explaining the
think
existence of the category, but
No.
your argument is bolstered by the fact that there are
Yeah.
people who were put in that category who are no longer.
But the real, contravention of U.S. law is holding people based on suspicion, which is really anathema to our entire system. Now, I have long felt, early on in the Obama administration, there was a push to move all of Guantanamo to Thompson in Illinois, to a prison in Illinois, and it was opposed by a lot of people. I supported it because, as one of the guys who was involved in Guantanamo at the beginning, the whole reason for Guantanamo's existence is to avoid the law. It was to create a zone outside the law, a zone where you can hold people based only on suspicion. And I
But the
felt
intention of Thompson was to continue that status on U.S. soil.
but Carol, as a lawyer, the reason that they don't have constitutional rights is because they're outside U.S. sovereign territory. The second they're in the U.S., They have those
willing to
rights.
take the risk.
They have those rights. There's no way, and as I used to say, if they were here, they would have been out.
And that's
No.
why Wells talks about the grand bargain, because
No,
when Senator McCain says he wants a plan that continues to assert
But he
that
doesn't.
lack of... that-
No, but I don't understand why people.
Well, because
Congress doesn't have the right to violate the Constitution. They revoked habeas corpus and said it's constitutional. So the Constitution, there's no way that these people could be held without charge based on suspicion consistent with the due process clause of the Constitution. Now, Wells is right. So the reason we haven't had that, it makes us totally dependent on the largesse of first the Bush administration, the Obama administration to let them out. We haven't had a legal remedy. It's awfully late now, and it would take a few years to do it, so I hope we get them out before then. But I think the important thing is a legal remedy, and I would like to reestablish, I think the fact that the D.C. Circuit has said that the people at Guantanamo don't have due process rights is appalling, and I'd like to reverse that. Can I raise one other question back at you? I think the real issue of Guantanamo as a security panel is we might be talking to the choir here. Everybody might agree with us. But a lot of people in this country feel, and they might not like it, but they feel that we need a place outside the law to deal with terrorism. They feel we need torture. I ask you, I mean, my feeling has always been that we don't, that ultimately it hurts us, that we are much better off and we are stronger by sticking to our principles. I don't know why we always abandon them, but from a security standpoint, most people out in the country think, oh, we need a little torture. I might not like it, but I like this place where we can put Muslims where there's no law. We've got to address that issue. I think it's the wrong issue. So, excuse me for throwing it back.
Don't you think don't you think torture is kind of underlying everything about Guantanamo?
Yes.
I mean, that was my conclusion after interviewing all of you and many others, is that torture is why the prosecutions are not able to really go forward. It's why no one can answer your questions. It's why, just as a person who, as an observer, it's why the place is so deeply uncomfortable. It's the original crime that happened there. It's this terrible thing, and
it's not so much that it happened there. It happened.
Right.
Period. But it is that it happened in a way that affected those cases, and I don't know if it's in every case, but it is it's sort of the symbol of how far these things can go when you get outside the law. So I do think they're connected. I do think the thing about Guantanamo, though, that Tom raised is very interesting about evidence. We hear this all the time. We don't have it. Why aren't you trying these guys, right? We don't have enough evidence to try them. Now, some of that reason is because the evidence was gained by torture, or the individuals were tortured,
But
right?
it's not just torture. They're just.
No, I know that. And some of it
unreliable.
is the case that they just don't have evidence.
There's
It's
not evidence.
unreliable.
We might suspect them a little bit.
It's that they don't think that they're criminals in some instances. They don't think that they're guilty of something.
Well, no,
they are war prisoners.
Okay, so
they are not prisoners of war.
I want to bring Dan in here and to enlighten us about. It's so hard.
I think
to be
Dan's
the one
happy.
person.
I think Dan's been happy.
And then we're going to go to questions. And if you think these questions were bad, no. And to talk about a little bit about just, and you don't have to expand, but a lot of things have been talked about here that are in uncomfortable territory. And I want to know, in those National Security Council, White House discussions, were these kinds of issues raised, discussed, debated? Were the detainees thought about in terms of who they are? And was it just considered so intractable, or was the discussion narrowed for the purpose of practicality to get through it? And you don't have to answer. And you could answer the way Tom answers.
It's a good question. These issues absolutely are discussed at the individual detainee level. Detainee treatment is discussed and is considered. Wells, and folks who work for the detainees, who represent the detainees, and other human rights groups come in and meet with the White House and White House officials and Defense Department officials and talk about detainee treatment and keep us focused on it. And it's something that we are focused on, even as we're focused on the greater policy of trying to transfer people out of Guantanamo. It's true that, I mean, one of the reasons that the president, I think, wants to close Guantanamo is because it's a recruitment tool for terrorism. The orange jumpsuits were the individuals who were executed by ISIS were put in orange jumpsuits, and that reflects back on the orange jumpsuits of the early days of Guantanamo Bay. So there's no question that that's one of the motivating factors for trying to close it. It has this stain on it from practices that are no longer in place. And one thing that I think is a little unhelpful to a serious discussion about where we are today and our efforts today to close Guantanamo is to talk about practices that President Obama in his first days in office prohibited, which are enhanced interrogation practices. People on this panel are calling it torture. Those practices were prohibited by President Obama immediately upon coming to office. They're no longer in place. We don't, treat detainees that way. And the focus should be less on how the media is treated if they are in some kind of if there's a lot of sand around where they're driven around, and more focused on how the detainees are treated. And I would let the Defense Department talk about detainee treatment and speak to it officially, but that's the focus, and it is a focus for the administration.
But detainee treatment at this point is a talking point. It's not something that they'll speak to in meaningful substance, in part because it's entered the courts, and they won't speak to it. I want to ask a question, which is, Wells says maybe Obama, I think Wells says, maybe Obama went off the rails in his desire to close it when he didn't bring the Uyghurs here, I think.
I don't know that that was the earliest point, but that was certainly a defining moment.
Yes, exactly. So, but I'm wondering what the administration thinks was the moment in which they sort of lost the momentum, which they clearly have decided that they're going to try to regain. I mean, we're in a period of absolute, drive towards that. There's a plan coming, 16 people left. But where, in the administration view, where did it go off the rails?
So I don't speak for the administration, so I can't answer that question.
So in your view, as not an administration, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't have asked you about the administration view. It's just that where did it go wrong?
It went wrong early. It went wrong really early. I don't know if I'd agree, but certain by the archive speech, you already knew you were in the wrong place. That's like 4 months after he's in office. So something happened, and I know that some people have said, it was there after Obama took office. They were the first, not Guantanamo related. They were the first truly serious interrupted attacks against, plots against U.S. soil in the first 11 months after Obama came into office that we'd seen since 9/11. And in that period of time, a lot of things, I think, so I'm not sure these are separate, but that hadn't happened not all of it had happened in such a profound way by the archive speech. So I don't know what happened. I mean, I can't, you and I have both interviewed a lot of people on this. I mean, I think one of the things that happened was, as you've reported, as a lot of people have said, collecting all the information on these individuals, which hadn't been done prior to that period of time, maybe to make the statement, we're going to close Guantanamo without knowing that we didn't have the information collected, might have been one of the first.
Well, I do think when they opened the files, they were a little bit shocked at how unreliable some of the information was, and they got stuck.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of where it went off the rails, I think it was an evolution, right? I mean, certainly there was a decision made to embrace, if you will, the concept of indefinite detention. That was the archive speech, as well as the resumption of military commissions, which, in our view, at the Center for Constitutional Rights, was a major strategic error in terms of trying to close the prison. But then you have the underwear bomber, and you have the inability of the president at that point in time to withstand or push back against the political the political rhetoric, the firestorm that came out as a result of that. And you have, you have sort of this give and take, I guess, maybe a way to or ebb and flow, really, with respect to Guantanamo policy in the early days, because when we were litigating cases, right, after Boumediene, we were winning 75 to 80% of the cases in the district court.
Yeah.
And so there were transfers that were happening, right? They were transferring people to moot their cases. That was a major, major, major component of early Guantanamo policy. And that continued until, right around the time of the underwear bomber, and then you had a decision from the DC Circuit, the first merits decision in a case called Al-Bahani, and the court, the circuit from that point on essentially reached a conclusion, I think it's correct to say, authorized the administration to continue to hold detainees at Guantanamo based on little more than government say-so, right? There were a series of decisions from that point on, and so I think the administration realized, wait a second, we can fight these cases even if we lose at the district court. We'll prevail at the circuit, which is what's happened, and so you have sort of a gradual turning away from the process of transfers. You have a resumption of the military commissions, and then by 2011, by January 2011, you have basically the president's turned his back on the prison, and you have Congress step in to fill the void, right?
And to Carol's point, I mean, it was the government that was arguing these cases in the circuit court, so it can't. So it's sort of a hard.
Absolutely. I mean, when I started out the discussion tonight by saying the president has long had authority to close the prison, right? One of the things that the president could decide to do and could have decided to do from the very beginning was not to contest.
That's right.
Litigation.
So we're going to have. People are going to yell at me afterwards because I didn't give them a chance. And C-SPAN, wait, I have to take some questions. Let's get some questions so that everybody doesn't yell at us afterwards. Please remember that this is on C-SPAN, so speak quickly. Use the mic. Make it a question, not a speech. And where can I see where the mics are so that okay. Okay.
I just have a mic.
Oh, you have the mic.
I don't have a question.
Okay, who has questions? Could you raise your hands? Joshua. Identify yourself.
Joshua Draytel. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in New York, also litigated in Guantanamo. Hi, Tom. This is not a criticism of Mr. Rosenthal, but...
Good, thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, no, because...
But here it comes.
Yeah, no, just because you sort of repeated something that is taken as fact when I'm going to provide a different scenario, which is and merge two concepts. One is sort of legal resistance to the commissions and the concept of torture, which is that rather than criminal defense or defense lawyers gumming up the commissions gum themselves up in their resistance to litigating torture. That if they let the lawyers litigate torture, these cases would have moved a lot faster. And Carol probably has the best institutional memory in terms of the course of it, but if Tom and Wells want to talk about, even though they're not directly involved in the commissions, just how many times, either through the pressing of the button, the classification procedures, the competency procedures, all of that has been delayed by the government, not by the defense.
Do you want to comment? You don't have to.
No, thanks a lot for the comment. I mean, I would just say that at least from my vantage point, when I had the opportunity and the privilege of serving in the White House, our focus was on the policy of transferring detainees out and not on the military commissions, which are sort of run themselves in some way, and General Martins runs them. So I don't have any specific comment as follow-up, but I appreciate your thoughts.
It wasn't meant for you to answer because that's not your mandate, but the others who have been involved.
Yeah.
More questions, Justin, over here.
Hi, thank you. Bruce Rosen, just a citizen, not an attorney.
Great.
I'm not an attorney.
Attorneys are citizens also, by the way.
I understand that, but I'm not. Two what I think are entwined things, this idea of gitmos being established because it was out there, the question of it is our sovereignty, it's with the unfair treaty with Cuba, and it's come up on the question, who can or can't run for president? So that out there of what is or isn't our territory, and the other part of it since you're dealing with a great moral issue, and I much appreciate that, and it seems to only be schools like this one, Cardozo, and the CUNY Law School, and not two biggies on this island that deal with those issues. I much appreciate that. The idea of cruel and unusual punishment, which torture comes under, we have this whole other thing, this debate in this country over capital punishment, and we know that people have been proven innocent and yet have been executed because governors have said the process must go on. So you're discussing a process that goes on ridiculously. So I'm not sure how to frame the close to this. I'm wondering, is this really out there, and is this really discussing what is an integral thing to the way we conduct the law in the United States, and it just happens to be on the island of Cuba?
Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I think that's what it is. I mean, any fictitious, artificial idea that we can do this because Cuba's not us is crazy. Or not Cuba's not us, but Guantanamo, a base we've controlled completely for over 100 years, which is just as Kennedy has said, is for all practical purposes America. We can't give an excuse for violating our fundamental laws by saying, oh, we're doing it elsewhere. I mean, it's so reprehensible. And I worry, even if we close Guantanamo, those precedents, in a way, are still in the books. And you know what? And I have a question for Dan. Was that no, and this isn't a question, but you discussed Wells has made the point. It's extraordinary to me that the administration that says it wants to close Guantanamo has made aggressive use of DC Circuit opinions, which we consider crazy, to say that the laws don't apply in Guantanamo, that you need to be a presumption of accuracy for raw intelligence reports that everybody knows are crazy. Has the administration, and this isn't a criticism, but did they ever discuss, hey, why don't we tell the Justice Department to stop opposing these cases? I mean, because that would clear a lot of these things too.
So I'm not going to answer a different question, but I will give you an unsatisfactory answer, which is I don't feel comfortable talking about internal deliberations in the government. So to the extent whether we have this conversation or not, I can't confirm one way or the other. And to the extent that these are matters that are involve ongoing litigation by the Justice Department, I would defer those types of questions to them. Sorry.
I can answer that question.
And I just wanted to say, I'll try and do it in 2 sentences. The fact that the Obama administration wants to move these people to U.S. soil and believes that they can continue to hold them in this law of war detention means that they think it's legitimate, whether it's at Gitmo or at U.S. soil. So Tom and I will disagree on this. Tom believes you get them here, you get them into the courts, and the whole house of cards falls down. The Obama administration believes they can continue this paradigm of law of war detention for Al-Qaeda, in brackets, on U.S. soil. So they believe that it's legal and legitimate whether it's there or here. They wouldn't be trying to do it here if they didn't believe that.
Why do you say that?
Oh, you think it's a plan to bring him here to just sort of implode the whole doctrine?
Well, I think, I don't see how they can think that they could hold people, first of all, based purely on suspicion and not evidence. See, you're saying that they're Al-Qaeda in the law of war. Don't assume that. If these are just suspicion about that, they need to prove it. That's something you can challenge in court. Then there's a challenge. Can you really? I don't believe they believe that. I really don't.
So why do you think they intend to bring them here?
Because they're trying to get them to close Guantanamo.
Well, actually, it's interesting about that is that the question is, how it's amazing, Tom, and I find it fascinating that. You're so hopeful about the system of the rule of law and justice in the country. It's really, and I think a lot of lawyers have talked this way, and I find it really interesting because I think the larger question here is what has happened to the rule of law in the criminal justice system over the course of time since 9/11? And have we lost ground permanently, or is this just an aberration? And I think this debate that and we don't know the answer, and the debate that you're having is really over what that answer will be. And so, and something I think we should think long and hard about. Adam, do you have a question?
Tom mentioned earlier the number of cases that the government is opposing regarding Guantanamo. One of them is fighting the release of force-feeding videos. Now, if the goal is to close Guantanamo, why fight against transparency that might spark a public outcry against that?
I think what we've... Go ahead.
You want to go?
No, you should go.
I was just going to say, I think that speaks to this issue of detainee treatment. And, you know, when you talk about complaining about, you know, one's access or the experience that you might have as a visitor or reporter there, the reason you're having that experience is because there is no discussion about detainee treatment. There is the release of these videos, for example, is something that the government has been fighting. There is no transparency. It's an opaque system. And so that is one of the biggest problems, is the opacity of virtually everything in the single, you have a single line that comes from the government or comes from the military about who the detainees are, how they're being treated, what the goal is, and you can't question it because they will not give you any room to maneuver to even ask the questions. And that,
Poor Dan, he's not responsible for that.
I'm
I just
sorry.
want to point out.
But I just think that that's an important point, that this issue of detainee treatment or treatment in general.
One more question, and I'm going to ask each one of you to just so you can think about it, to say, is it going to close by the end of the Obama presidency, yes or no? And you don't even have to explain. Wait for the microphone and identify yourself. And please be brief because we're out of time.
My name is Alexander Nicolaitis. I'm a Columbia PhD. I'm a sociologist and an expert on organizations. I commend you for focusing on Guantanamo, but I feel insulted by the focus only on Guantanamo, which is a politically correct focus. I have been followed around the world. The government has spent millions of dollars. I'm in constant surveillance. They will comment on what I'm doing in my house, and every night I can't hear anything outside my house. My hearing is perfect, but every night I can't hear anything outside my house, okay? They have small drones.
So we're going to take two more, thank you.
Yeah, 1 second.
Well, we're going to take two more questions, and they're going to come focus.
I have drones and planes buzzing over my house.
Okay, you know what? Excuse me.
Thank you
You could
very
talk
much.
to me afterwards about that. Thank you. We're going to take two more questions in a row. We're going to answer them at the end. First here in the front row. Anybody in particular you wanted here?
We're talking about high stakes issues, and a lot of the treatment is in service of information to protect us, and the way you're speaking about the way we go about law. I've worked in the prisons in the city, in New York City. I know Rikers Island is under kind of a scrutiny for handling the way they handle prisoners, and I really kind of saw a lot there. It was like the Middle Ages. So it sort of speaks to me when you say it's our process. It's people are in detention for months on end and years, and it's because another reason. It's small stakes issues, and it's like somebody needs to direct attention to that as well.
Remember that this is what Eric Holder, on some level, says he's going to talk about now, that he's going to focus on now that he's out of office, and who knows, maybe someone else will. One more very quick question.
We want to answer questions.
What?
My name is Chris Brandt. I teach here at Fordham in the Peace and Justice program. You've all been talking about what can be done within the law. I belong to a group called Witness Against Torture, and we have, for the past 11 years, gone to Washington every anniversary, every January 11th, and done civil disobedience actions. We've gone outside the law to try to bring attention to this matter. What I'd like to know is, has anybody noticed?
Great.
Very few people, unfortunately, and it's a shame. And what you do is great.
Yes, there are people who've noticed. I'll tell you who notices. The people who notice are the men detained in Guantanamo, because we tell them. And, I mentioned Tarek Boda at the outset, right? It's a classic example of the president not doing everything he could, right? Fighting a case that it shouldn't fight, right? To release a person that the government says it wants to release. He knows about this, right? And so we certainly appreciate on his behalf and on behalf of the other men that we represent.
And I would argue that far too few do, because when I tell people I cover Guantanamo full time, more often than not, they say, "Didn't we close that?"
Last question. Did you have a question? Yep.
Hi, John Neffel. A question for Carol. Do you have any sense of what Camp 7 in a possible Gitmo North might look like? I mean, the CIA's role at Guantanamo is sort of always in the shadows. What might that look like if it is moved to the mainland?
Explain what Camp 7 is.
So Camp 7 is the prison that the reporters aren't taken to, that the reporters aren't allowed to know. That I sued to find out how much the people spent to build it, and was told that's a secret, a state secret. It is the place where they brought the men who were held, disappeared into the CIA black sites for 3 and 4 years between 2002 and 2006. And it is a prison within the prison at Guantanamo that is a maximum security prison where one of Wells' clients is there, where because of what happened to them, they are considered to some degree to be classified human beings, because they know state secrets, like where they were held and what was done to them, that we the people are not allowed to know. So it is a top security, maximum security secret prison by virtue of the people it holds, not by virtue of what they've done, because some of them, half of them have never been charged with crimes, and not by virtue of their behavior, because what little we know about it is they are highly compliant, but because they need to be segregated from the rest of the prisoners, because the rest of the prisoners, just like we the people, can't know where they were held and what was done to them. So I guess the question is, if they bring it to Guantanamo North, do I have any expectations that they'll be able to mix and mingle with the others? And the answer is no. I think that as long as aspects of their experience are considered classified, the people who control that classification, which we presume to be the CIA, will control their access. Thompson was a model of kind of what Guantanamo North could have been, and it had something that would very much look like Camp 4, communal, POW style, Hogan's Heroes detention, where people could live together, eat together, pray together, which exists today. And then it had something that was more like maximum security, where individual prisoners who they were afraid of or who misbehaved were put in single cell solitary confinement. And then we had this other place which holds the CIA people. When they looked at Thompson, you could look at the superstructure and see how they would duplicate all three of those there. So I think Wells could probably talk in a general sense of, if his client were moved there, does he think he'd have any more contact than he has now?
Well, I didn't take a page out of your playbook and say that Camp 7 and those clients I can't talk about.
Right, but
Okay, so nobody can talk. It's not just.
I'll talk.
Don't worry about it. So
I want to know how much it costs.
So
I sued and lost.
Okay, so we're going to have concluding comments. In those comments, you can answer questions that were asked or comments that were made that you want to reflect on. But mostly, what I want you to say is whether or not you think Guantanamo is going to close by the end of this presidency, which would be a year from now. Tom, we're starting with you.
I doubt it, because of the pace at which it's moving. But my concluding comment is more that the only way, you assume Guantanamo can be duplicated in a law where the law applies. It can't. I'm worried the way the law exists now from the DC Circuit, people held at Guantanamo, or people held technically outside the sovereign territory of the United States, have no rights, no due process, or they're not entitled to due process of law. I worry about that continuing, because I worry that Donald Trump or Ted Cruz will be president. It's a system we need to shut down. It's an abomination to our system. I do have faith where law applies, that people will not be allowed to be held on the basis of suspicion or, false information. So,
Dan?
and I think that's what America stands for. So,
I'm hopeful that it'll close by the end of the Obama administration. I think people in the Obama administration are likewise hopeful that it will close, and they're working hard to do it. The only other thought I would make, and it's similar to the point that I made at the outset, is, you just have to maybe take my word for this, but when I went to work every day, I didn't go to work because I was trying to, violate the law or, perpetuate this lawless zone or anything like that. I went to work because I believe in the Constitution. I believe in our government. I believe in national security, and people go to work, and people who I work with went to work every day and worked really hard to try to fix this problem. It's a hard problem. There are legal complexities, there's classification complexities, there's legacy issues. It's a hard problem. You don't want to just release people willy-nilly who might be dangerous and might re-engage in terrorism. On the other hand, you don't want to keep them any longer than is absolutely necessary. So you try hard to transfer them when you can, as quickly as you can, with conditions that are in place to make sure that they don't come back to re-engage in terrorism. It's a hard problem, but people in government are working in good faith as hard as they can to get it done.
Wells?
Well, I too am hopeful that Guantanamo will close, and I do take the president at his word when he says that it's a priority for him personally, a priority for the country, for his administration. But whether he succeeds in closing prisons entirely up to him. I will confess that I don't understand a lot of the decisions that are made, or in some cases are not made, with respect to closing Guantanamo. I still, for the life of me, will not understand why the government continues to litigate some of these cases, continues to fight to keep Tarek Bouda in prison so that it can continue to force feed him, even though he's been approved for transfer. I don't understand those decisions, and I think unless there are major, substantial policy changes at the White House level, that Guantanamo is not going to close. But I remain hopeful, I have to remain hopeful, that those changes are going to come, and that they're going to come quickly.
I have no idea if Guantanamo is going to close as a journalist. But what I do think, I hope it does, I do wonder whether at this point in time, the Guantanamo is more than just the prison. It's a state of mind. It's a situation. It's a state of mind that we've allowed ourselves to have, which has tolerated things that should be intolerable, including the sort of winnowing away of human rights and of law, and just the kind of bendableness that that our approach to terrorism has been. And I think that the most important thing is that we need to face our fears about terrorism. There's not been real accountability. I think that's one of the central problems with Guantanamo, is the accountability. That's why the past is important, because the past happened, and we can deny it and forget it and pretend it didn't exist, but then it will just continue to perpetuate. I think there should be real accountability. That would be huge, and I think that the whole narrative about terrorism needs to be, in some ways, changed and dealt with more realistically.
Carol? I don't know how we get there between now and then. I don't know how 91 men who are there today are gone by the time the president goes home, leaves office. I have heard lots of ideas, but I just can't see mechanically how that happens. The only way it happens, I guess, is if you move them to the United States. And so then you can close that detention center, you can close that zone at the base in Cuba, and you can call those, whatever subset of those last 91 men, prisoners of another place. But I don't see how you get them out of there, and I don't see how the next thing isn't Guantanamo.
political prisoners in the United States, and at some point you're going to have to deal with them. Average citizens, they're not telling the truth. Okay?
So we're gonna.
I was just gonna.
We're gonna-
I was just gonna add one other.
We're
thing.
gonna-
Thank you, and I'm sorry.
I just want to add one other thing. To understand the complexity of it, I wrote a story last night and this morning about a man named Mohammed Bouazir who was offered resettlement. He's a cleared detainee, and he was given a country that was willing to take him in and resettle him. And when it came time for him to get on that plane yesterday, he did not go. He was, his lawyer said, afraid of the new country that might take him in, that maybe he's become such a, institutionalized human being that he was unwilling to take resettlement. One of the ways you close Guantanamo under Bush administration policy and the policy that the Obama administration inherited is you don't send Yemenis back to Yemen. And as long as you're not willing to send Yemenis back to Yemen, they need to agree to go to resettlement in other countries. And while it was unheard of to me before yesterday that somebody would not want to leave Guantanamo, this man didn't. And so there's a lot going on, case by case, individual by individual, that makes it very hard to imagine how those last 91 get out of there.
I want to end this on a positive note. So I'm going to say this. I think it's going to close. I think it's going to close by the end of the presidency. I don't think it'll be closure in the way I would have liked to define closure. I do think it'll close that way. And ironically, I think the hardest nut to crack is not going to be the Yemenis or even indefinite detention. It's going to be the military commissions. So I would suggest, just as much as the PRBs are what need to be sped up and have more of, that the inability of the military commissions to function be addressed now, because that's something that's resolvable. So on that note, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next year. I know.